Welcome to Kronos Talks, a place for some candid thoughts on the worlds of sustainable finance and corporate sustainability. I'm your host, Elliot Frankel, and I'm handing over the mic today to our CEO, Rory Sullivan, and a special guest all the way from Australia, Dr. Ian Woods. Ian is an international climate change expert, founder of IGCC, the Australia-New Zealand Investor Group on Climate Change, previously of AMP Capital, and a long-time associate of Kronos. So with 3 weeks to go till COP30 in Brazil, we're delighted to have this chat. So, Rory, I'm going to hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elliot. Ian, welcome to London.
Thanks very much, Rory. It's great to be here.
It's been a long time. It's probably been 30 years since we first worked together.
It has been, unfortunately, or fortunately, it has been a long time we've been working together.
Almost as long, as says Rory in a perfect segue, as long as the international climate negotiation process have been going on. Would you say, Ian?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can remember when I was here last, they were I'm now definitely showing age, the UNFCCC was just being signed.
Yeah.
In 1992. So that's showing how long this whole process has been going on for with regard to climate change.
Yeah, and I remember at the time, I mean, it was probably post the Rio Earth Summit, there was I guess there was both sort of a sense of excitement about the potential of climate policy and climate negotiations. And there was also this sense of staring into a void. Oh my goodness, what do we need to do here? What is your sense of where we've got to on climate policy is one half the question, and then where do we need to go next? So I realise they're two quite mega questions, but if we frame the discussion in that way, Ian, and we can then unpick some of the nuances around both what's needed and then more specifically what the role of investors might be in that.
Yeah, well, I think sadly probably the climate change policies, as you say, probably sat in the too hard basket for probably the first 20 years. There was some talking about it and umming and ahhing, etc. And it really was only, I think, Paris that made countries and, to be honest, companies, I think, start taking notice and thinking, right, what do we actually need to do here and how are we going to get it? And time is running out. So I think climate change policy is still only relatively new, even if it's 10 years old. So I think as a result of that, and due to a whole range of economic and political aspects across the world, it's still incredibly fragmented. It's still quite high level. It's still not providing, I think, as a general thought across the world, it's not providing the signals to either investors or companies about addressing climate change and providing the investment incentives that are needed, whether it's carbon price being too low. But I think the good thing is that that's starting to change, and certainly we're seeing that in Australia. It's been a fraught process in Australia with the climate negotiations due to political reasons. But I think that the tide has changed there, which is encouraging. And then we're starting to see some development in the area of climate change policy, which will really help push the agenda in Australia.
I slightly disagree with your characterisation of the international climate policy space, because I think actually the first 20 years, let's say up to the Paris Agreement, actually were a lot about building the kind of institutions and systems and the processes needed. I mean, I agree that from an outcomes perspective, it was probably took too long and was too slow, but actually the Paris Agreement and the implementation of the Paris Agreement couldn't have happened without that work. I think what the Paris Agreement, and I guess actually also the IPCC's 1.5 degree report in 2018 did, was it actually said we need to pivot explicitly from processes, so emissions inventories and data and so forth, to a much more explicit focus on outcomes. Even though I share your frustration with the rate of progress, I think we also can't forget it's only been 10 years since we really started as a community talking properly about outcomes, and this whole 1.5 degrees orientation or net zero focus really only became a thing 5 years ago, I would say, like 2019, 2020, and is probably even more recent in terms of its incorporation into initiatives like C100 Plus. So in some ways, I share your fear. We haven't gone far enough, fast enough. But I also think when we look at international climate policy, we also do need to acknowledge that it has come much further than perhaps you would expect over any sort of 10-year process.
Yeah, that's I was being a bit harsh and probably reflecting being part of the climate change area for 35 years, and it just seems glacial. And maybe I was being a bit harsh in my judgment of what was needed, because you're right that some of the discussions about what the responsibilities of certain countries are, what mechanisms could or can be used for emission reductions and sharing the burden and the costs were being developed in those first 20 years, as reflected, I guess, by the Kyoto Protocol.
And before we turn to Australia, I would like to just get your views on the relative importance of international policy versus domestic policy. So while obviously a lot of the action happens at domestic level, I'm interested in, is international policy, the COPs and that whole institutional frame, is that still important, and why is it important, or what role does it play as we move through the next 10, 15, 20 years of work on climate change?
I think it's still critical, because it's the judgment of countries against what others are doing and the level of ambition and who's taking responsibility or not taking responsibility, as the case may be. So I think that's still important in terms of setting the agenda at a domestic level, and also addressing some of the really big issues around compensation, especially for adaptation and small islands in the Pacific and other areas which will be severely impacted by climate change, almost irrespective of the mitigation we undertake now, because some of it's baked in.
I agree with that framing, that it remains really important for framing. It also probably remains important as a forum whereby issues can get discussed, even if they're not resolved or progress is slow. So, Ian, speaking of small island states, that is a beautiful segue into Australia. Now, listeners may not know this, but actually we first met 30 plus years ago in London, where we both worked for the same consulting company. You returned to Australia. I followed sometime later as a backpacker, and we ended up working for a consulting company in Australia. I mean, you have subsequently remained in Australia and worked with AMP for many years and have played a leading role in the IGCC, the investor group on climate change. I did my PhD on voluntarism and public policy, with most of the analysis based on the Australian Greenhouse Challenge. I have, obviously, as you have and as others have, would have seen subsequently how Australia's had a series of elections where climate change has almost been the defining issue, or the central issue of the policy debate. And I think the debate has been at times rancid. We've seen cheap political point scoring over climate. We've seen very progressive initiatives and then unwound and then being reinstated, etc. At the end of all that, so I think I started my PhD in 1999 or thereabouts. So that's, I don't know, let's say 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Has Australia come a long way? I mean, so how would you describe the state of play of public policy first, and then we might turn to the investor community and its contribution to action on climate change? But at a sort of a top level, Australia, hero or loser?
Oh, that's a tough. Australia's climate change policy has been a terrible journey. It's been 2 steps forwards, 2 steps back, sometimes even 3 steps back, and then a step forward and a step back, which has just created so much uncertainty, which has been a frustration, I think, certainly to investors and to companies. I think that tide has changed. I think politically, maybe notwithstanding what some politicians might say, there's a collective agreement that we really need to do something about this, and it's about time we did it, and we need some policies in place to get us where we need to be. And I think this current government especially has really introduced some policies which are providing the framework by identifying, what needs to be done, and also starting to implement some of the policies that need to help in the implementation, whether that is a safeguard mechanism in Australia, which is sort of like an emissions trading scheme, for the want of a better word, though you're not allowed to say that word in Australia, to the physical risk assessment that the government's done. Again, we didn't have a good baseline against which policy could be developed and say, well, where are we? Where do we want to prioritise, etc. We're starting getting some of those foundational things in place, and that is a significant step forward.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit about sector pathways? Because it strikes me, I mean, if you're a long-time investor, have talked about, long, loud and legal, in terms of policy expectations. Australia seems to have done a lot of work on thinking about what the transition looks like for particular sectors. I'm just interested if you could explain maybe the regulatory basis for that or the policy base for that, and then just give a high level overview of what they are, because I think it sort of leads us then into the role that investors and investor networks have played in shaping that discussion.
Well, I think like a lot of countries, the rate at which different parts of the Australian economy can decarbonise varies significantly. Where energy intensive parts of our industry, aluminium industry, iron and steel, we're obviously a significant exporter of fossil fuels. So I think the question was, well, Australia can have a emission reduction target of 43%, but who's going to be doing it? Who's responsible for achieving it? And is everyone sort of pointing the finger at everyone else saying, well, I think you should be doing it? And at the moment, that hasn't been too much of a problem because the electricity sector, which has been heavily coal-fired based, has obviously been the go-to player, and everyone goes, yeah, well, it's renewable energy, really. But now I think we're starting to get to the pointy end of, well, yes, but to get to the next stage, we have to start thinking about, well, where is the next lot of reductions going to come? And I think that precipitated the discussion about, well, what is the responsibility of different sectors, and do we have a good idea of what our, dare I say, national abatement curve look like? And I'd start to identifying, right, these sectors are where the next abatement should start coming, and therefore what are the policies that are needed to facilitate that emission reduction? Is just the policies got in place sufficient? Yes, no, probably no. So I think that has been what's really helped. So in terms of what has actually been done is, and as I say, investors have been have an important role in this, is that for each of the key sectors, the 6 macro sectors that in the Australian economy, the government's got the CSIRO and the Federal Treasury to do some modelling about how we actually get to the target of net zero by 2050 and some intermediate targets. And as a result of that, we're starting to see, okay, what is the role of different sectors in terms of it reaching the goals that we've got? I think the important thing in that discussion is that recognise, you're trying to think about what the future's going to be, and you are going to be wrong, but you just have to start at a place, work from that, and it's an iterative process. And until you kind of do that process, it's people just sort of shrug their shoulders and go, well, what am I supposed to do? Now, what role do I play?
And these pathways, can investors and others then use them for investment decision making, or is it about corporate strategy, or is it for public policymakers to say, well, we need these policy instruments and incentives in place to deliver this? I'm just interested in what they are in a concrete sense, because they're clearly not scenarios. They're not like an imaginary future. They are intended to drive some kind of action. I'm just interested in where they fit in either public or private action.
Well, I think it's probably all three. It's investors, government and companies, because I think what was realised is we all need to be on the same page. You can't have companies doing actions or thinking about what they're doing separate from what government sets as targets, and clearly investors also need to understand what is going to be expected of the companies they invest in, what the implications might be for their investment plans and valuations, and what input can investors give both to companies and to government. So I think trying to get everyone on the same page, however rough that might be, was critical, because then you're all, dare I say, singing off the same song sheet.
And what has happened with these pathways now they've been developed? Is government framing policy by reference to them, or are companies investing against them?
It's still early days, because I think there was some that came out September, October last year by the Climate Change Authority, and that there's some more sector pathways that have come out more recently in the last month or so, and I think people are digesting it. But to give you an idea of what investors are doing is that they're looking at those pathways and then looking at the companies they invest in and say, well, is there alignment between what the government is expecting, whatever sector a company may be in, to reduce its emissions by 2030 and 2035, and what are companies saying? Is there an alignment there? And if there's not an alignment, why is there not an alignment? Is there not the same understanding of technology with regard to how well it's developed? Or is it just people just didn't understand they needed to abate quicker than what they thought, which is usually the issue? That's starting to provide a basis of a discussion between investors and companies about what they're doing.
So, Ian, can you talk about the role that investors have played in this, whether it's the collective initiatives like IGCC or individual investors, what investors did, why investors welcomed this, and perhaps what role they might play moving forward?
Yeah, well, I think investors were critical in the development of the sector pathways. The IGCC did a great job in just maintaining that relationship with the government and having some credibility about how it was positioning with regard to climate change. And the IGCC said to the government, your targets are great, but we need some certainty, well, not so much certainty, understanding of what's the thinking behind those targets. And so we can engage with our companies and understand with our investments what's going to be needed and where we need to put capital. So to do that, we need some sector pathways to understand that for our investments. And the government took that on board and went, right, okay, yeah, I get why. Just from a good policy perspective, we need to know who's going to do the work and how it's going to be done.
But why does the government listen to investors? I mean, yeah, we've had lots of investor calls and statements from individual and collective, and some of those have been very effective and have made a huge contribution. But I'm just interested, in the Australian context, sector pathways, I think, are one of the most significant policy innovations we've seen because they translate high-level targets into something substantive and useful. But I'm interested, how did investors actually crack this one and get heard and get the government to adopt something that speaks to the needs and concerns of investors? So what was the secret sauce, Ian?
What was the secret sauce? Well, I think unfortunately it's probably a mixture of sources. If you want to sort of
don't work it too hard. Let's just keep going.
I think just consistency in message has been a really critical thing, I think, for the IGCC, and that's probably come out of the fact that we've had so much political uncertainty and instability. The investors have just had to have a consistent message, irrespective of what the political flavour might be or whatever their policy was. And it helped, I guess, refine the message. What do investors really need or want on climate change? And about investment risk being a key aspect. And there's a cost to uncertainty. And it's an unnecessary cost to the Australian economy by having that uncertainty. And that is being proven in some of the aspects of certainly the electricity sector in Australia. So I think there was a credibility there. I think the other thing was there was that universal investor notion in terms of it going across the Australian economy. I think government appreciated that we were having a holistic view. We weren't, I guess, a sector pushing a barrow just for their own sectorial interests. So I think that was key. And then I think it was just the relationships. Again, relationships are really important. And understanding how policy is made and the processes in place that need it.
My understanding is a lot of that was convened through the IGCC, the Investor Group on Climate Change. Like, how important was it that it was convened and collated in that way versus, let's say, some larger institutions start doing one-on-one meetings with government?
Being a collective statement, it represented the whole industry. It wasn't a particular sort of views of one organisation within the industry. Having said that, the individual large organisations did support it and say, well, it's not just a group of individuals who are supposedly representing an industry. It does actually represent what the industry think, and large organisations and small ones within the sector supported what was being put forward.
So you say large organisations, but was it the head of responsible investment revenue? Because institutions and organisations carry weight, but so do individuals. I'm just interested in, did you get senior people involved, and were they able to articulate this?
I think that was probably one of the really key things. As you say, it wasn't the head of responsible investment that went to Canberra and spoke to the politicians and the policymakers. It was the CIOs and the chairs of asset owners and asset managers and the IGCC. And I think that was really important. It was the gravitas of that group which was critical in terms of politicians. They're short of time. They're choosy about who they speak to. And, if you're talking to the CIO or the CEO of a large asset owner in Australia, then, you spend your time talking to and listening to them and what they got to say. And that was absolutely critical. And there was a very organised engagement with using those people with the politicians and the policymakers in Canberra.
And did the politicians understand, not so much what they were saying, but why they were there and why investors were important to them as politicians or policymakers?
I think that was an important part of what the IGCC had been doing as well. I think they spent a lot of time in terms of just explaining the role of investors in the economy and why our voice actually was important. I think sometimes we as investors sort of assume that people know our role in the economy and what we do. And I think that's perhaps a dangerous assumption to make when you're going into talk policy or with anyone really. So that was also a really important aspect. And there was a need, I think politicians said, well, we need investment. Oh, well, there's a lot of money in super funds. Well, they could just pay for it. And you're like, well, hang on a sec. That doesn't work like that. But we're happy. We realise we need to contribute and we realise our companies need to contribute to this decarbonisation. So here's our perspective of what's going to need to achieve what you've set out. And I think that was really important.
One more question on the political context within which this occurred. So clearly Australia is highly dependent on the mining and agricultural sectors and, the associated metals processing industry. I'm just interested in how did you deal with the industry voices who I presume would have preferred not to see sectoral pathways or would have been perhaps even arguing very strongly for their particular industry or segment to get more generous allocations or a less ambitious trajectory. So how do you deal with that very strong constituency and other voices pressing politicians to move maybe in a different direction? What
has been an interesting development in the Australian context is, yes, you will always get your industry associations who want to push their own agenda, and I guess that's what they're there to do, and you can't criticise them for doing what they're saying they're doing. But there was a whole lot of other organisations, whether it be business organisations or even some industry associations, who also realised we need to move on and were starting to be much more progressive within constraints, but being much more positive contributor to the discussion. And I think that also really helped. You're not an isolated industry group saying so. So that was really important.
What about the divide in Australian politics? Because it has been a flip-flop from one side to the other. And how did you do this in a way that kind of made this resilient through the electoral cycle in Australia and the inevitability of changing governments on a fairly regular basis?
Well, I think being even-handed in terms of the engagement with the different political parties, recognising they're probably not going to agree with what you say, but giving them still the time to hear what we wanted to say and why we wanted to say it. I think it's fair to say certainly in the Liberal Party, which is sort of our Conservative Party in Australia, there was a range of views, and there were what we call moderates within the Liberal Party who were well on board and understood the issue. And there's obviously those who took a more conservative approach. But it was important to get those people on board. To be honest, it probably has been just this last government, who's now into its second term, where we've really seen the development. From a political perspective, what has been interesting, and I think given the government some confidence, I don't want to get too much to the politics, but there were some very traditional Liberal seats, certainly in the city areas of Sydney and Melbourne, where the Liberal Party's been the party of representation for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, their members weren't being elected, and independents who had a very pro-climate change approach were elected. And I think that was a real reflection that this was a real issue for Australia, certainly urban Australians. And it was sufficiently important that we're happy to kick out, sitting members, etc., in mainstream political parties.
So, Ian, that was a really interesting tour of the Australian policy landscape. We're almost at the end. I have a few quick-fire questions for you, if I may.
Yep. Go for it.
Okay. First one. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about climate policy in Australia?
I'm optimistic. Yep.
Why?
Well, let's say I think we're starting to get those foundations in place to get into the details of how to achieve the objectives. And I think, notwithstanding some of the side battles, the politics of it has been won.
Good. Next question is, can investors sustain this? So IGCC and others have done great work. We're now into the, in many ways, harder work of sustaining enthusiasm for implementation. Can it be sustained, or what do we need to do to keep that enthusiasm and collective work moving?
It certainly needs to move to a different phase. We're now having to get into the details. So I think it's going to change focus But that's not a bad thing, I don't think, because it is about getting into the details and having the nitty-gritty discussions with companies about what they're doing and when and how and what their assumptions are and what their capital investment is going to be. We're on much firmer ground, I think, now to have that discussion, and I think that's going to provide the foundation for that engagement.
Yeah, and I guess the work of the initiatives like the Transition Plan Task Force and the International Transition Plan Network and CA 100 plus those initiatives, all of which are going from, we've done, I think as investors, done a pretty good job on getting people to make commitments and on setting at least high level targets and on building processes. And I think we're now into that interesting bit in the middle of, okay, what are the actions you're taking? How much it's going to cost? And also how do you ensure the success and resilience of the businesses making those decisions? So I think we're into in some ways, it feels like a different phase. So last question, Ian, what next? Is it this implementation question that's the priority, or are there other aspects of climate change that investors now need to be thinking about?
I think it's all about implementation. It's about now having that discussions with companies about what they're doing and whether they're aligned. What the sector pathways have done has shone the light on how developed technologies are and where they're up to. Some technologies can be implemented and they're just not being implemented, and need to think about what the signals might be to facilitate that investment in those new technologies. But other technologies, certainly in Australia's space, in the mining industry, which is a significant user of diesel for the trucks, needless to say, what technology needs to be developed and when, if we're going to achieve the targets we have. The focus becomes much more on those specific issues and what companies are doing or can do.
Thank you, Ian. So with that, I think we're finished. It is all about implementation. Dr. Ian Woods, thank you so much for joining us on the Chronos podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in person in about 2 minutes' time.
Terrific. Thanks, Rory. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Ian and Rory. Do have a look at the Chronos website or the Chronos LinkedIn account for all our news and updates. And thanks for listening.